Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Azam Faruqi, and I'll be doing your lunch and learn today. The topic of our discussion today is Moneyball 2.0. So, just to tell you a little bit about myself, I actually work in a private sector. I work for a bank. I've been in operations for the last little while. Um, and I also write about baseball analytics for a website called beyondtheboxscore.com. I've been doing that for the last couple of years. So my journey with baseball has been pretty interesting. I haven't been following baseball for as long as a lot of you probably have been. In fact, the first game I ever went to was in 2009. So the 10-year journey where baseball sort of became the focal point, and my passion over the last 10 years has been pretty interesting. And especially when we talk about analytics and everything. So it's just a sport that's probably perfectly designed for statistics. And I think that's one of the reasons I was gravitated towards the sport. So why are teams investing in analytics? So, I mean, you guys all work in technology. You understand the importance of data and, how that's helping us change the world. So the first one is availability of data. So both structured and unstructured obviously has created an opportunity for competitive advantage. So baseball's no different like any other industry. The more data we have, the better decisions you make. And the last 5-10 years, if you see that the proprietary information that all these teams have been using for the last little while, it's given them a lot of competitive advantage. So some of the teams that are really well known who were early adopters of analytics, Oakland Athletics, a lot of you probably saw Moneyball. And by the way, thank you for completing the survey because it kind of gave me a good understanding of what I should put together in a presentation. Tampa Bay Rays, a very small market team, and they've been very successful analytics. San Antonio Spurs have been very successful for a long period of time without having a high draft pick. And Olympique Lyonnais, the French soccer club, they actually won 5 straight French leagues and very analytic heavy club. Now, all organizations have different appetite for data. So some obviously use it a lot more than others. It depends on strength of information they have, different application of data. So a lot of teams obviously use it for in-game statistics, but some teams are venturing out into other areas like player development, fitness, and so on and so forth. And obviously frequency-based probability. So it helps us understand trends, and especially again in baseball, there are a lot of economic mathematical theories that you can employ, especially with a pitcher batter matchup. You're talking about game theory and you're talking about all these other applications. So it's always been very important in baseball. And obviously, lastly, it removes human biases. So obviously, traditionally, historically, the sports in general have relied a lot on scouts. So you talk about eye tests and you know what you know when you see it and all these things. So it takes out a lot of biases, especially when we talk about confirmation bias, recency bias, and the eye test. So just to give you an example, so over the last little while, obviously baseball, and again, probably like a lot of other industries, was static for a very long period of time. So the last 10 years, not only we have been able to have the data. Oh, okay. Okay, perfect, thanks. So not only have we had more data, which obviously has spurred analytics, but we've also have the ability now to collect and refine that data. So we've moved on from structured to unstructured. So if you see, it was pretty static for up until like mid 2000s, and then just since 2008 has significantly exploded, even in baseball. So next slide, please. Next one. So this is actually something interesting. I think SAS put this together, and I kind of like it. Just to give you an example, so you see the evolution, like you talk about standard reports, ad hoc, and then you move to statistical analysis, predictive modeling, and optimization. And it's interesting that even baseball, the evolution has followed a similar path. So when you talk about standard reports, you initially had all these traditional stats and metrics that kind of, you open up your newspaper and, you would read from the previous day what the box score said. And then people moved on to more like ad hoc reporting, like what can we make out of these? Then when we went into the Moneyball era, about 15, 16 years ago, there was a lot of statistical analysis. talking about, how do you use mathematics to find a competitive edge. And now we've moved on to predictive modeling and optimization. So teams have gone beyond just using statistics to value players, to basically valuing the whole rosters, and how do you create a predictive model to understand when you're signing a free agent, it doesn't depend on what he's done in the past, but how do you expect him to perform over the next 5, 6, 7 years when you're signing him to big contracts? So I just like to show this just because I think it kind of shows that the baseball evolution has followed a similar path than the rest of the industries as well. So traditional stats, most of us grew up with. So I'm sure anyone who's a baseball fan would identify these. So batting average, you have runs batted in, also known as RBI, runs scored, pitcher wins, earned runs average, ERA, and saves. Next slide, please. So the problem with these statistics is that over a period of time, baseball had been using them, and a lot of times that's how we have been valuing players. But the biggest issue is that none of these metrics actually tell us anything about a player's value. So for example, when you talk about batting average, now batting average was a stat that developed early part of probably the later part of 19th century. So at that time, averages were very high. Players were not hitting a lot of home runs. So you would see someone hitting 350, 375. So whenever someone developed that stat, they probably did not value walks as much. And they thought that hitting home run is not that big of a deal, because I think at one point the record for the season was 13 home runs. So you wouldn't, it was a rare occurrence. But right now it only tells us part of the story, which makes it a very meaningless stat. RBI is probably, if you look at the 3 worst stats that baseball has created, I think RBI would probably fall under one of them. It provides no value or no information about a skill of a player. All it is a function of an ability of a player ahead of you to get on base. So basically when you come on to bat, if you don't have players on base, you're not going to get an RBI unless you hit a home run. So it really doesn't tell how good you are. It depends on how good the people ahead of you were. So obviously a very meaningless stat. Next slide. Now, ERA has proven to be less reliable. Now, of all the traditional stats, I think ERA has held up better than other stats. The only problem with ERA is that when you compare players' performance year over year, it doesn't correlate well. So if you have a good ERA this year, there's no predictive value in it as to how a player will do next year or going forward. Because a lot of times ERA is sequence dependent. It is dependent a lot on team defense. So if one year team has good defense, pitcher might have a good ERA. Or for example, let's say a batter like a pitcher is pitching like Stroman, for example. Okay, someone comes onto the plate, hits a double. Next one comes onto the plate, hits a home run. So you've given up 2 earned runs. Now, however, if you flip it around, so if someone comes onto the plate first, hits a home run, and then the next one comes up and hits a double, it's just because of sequence, your ERA is higher in one case as opposed to the other, but that doesn't mean that he hasn't given up those 2 hits. So that way, ERA doesn't have that kind of predictive value. Next one. And the problem, as I mentioned, with the batting average, it treats all hits as equals. So obviously, all hits are not equal. We know that. Home run is more valuable than a triple, which is more valuable than a double, which is more valuable than a single, which is more valuable than a walk. And pitcher wins, again, is a measure of your team scoring more runs than the other. It doesn't really depend on whether you perform well or not. So back in the days, you had, especially in the 80s, you would hear Jack Morris, it was a day in, day out 20-game winner. Well, 20 game basically meant that during those 20 games, his team scored more runs than the other. It didn't really tell you whether he actually pitched well in those games or not. And that has been a conversation, and there's been a lot of pushback. People, because the traditional scouts and traditional old school baseball people would value wins a lot more. But when you start evaluating players, pitcher wins obviously provide no value at all. And then the next one. Saves. So saves is probably the most damaging stat that was invented in baseball over the last 100 years. Again, it tells us nothing about a pitcher's performance. And because of this one stat, it has kind of forced managers to change how they should manage their bullpen. No one optimizes their bullpen as much as they should just because of the fact that closers prefer to have saves on their sheet, like you know, in their career. So obviously that's one of the biggest thing. Now, a lot of times when analytics come on, people say that, these people really, you haven't played baseball, so you don't know. But the interesting that a lot of people don't realize is that even all these old school metrics were developed by newspaper journalists and other statisticians. They weren't developed by baseball people as such. So over the last 50 years, people started questioning the value of some of these. So all the sabermetrics is a fairly new phenomena. Moneyball came out about 15, 20 years ago. But people did start asking questions about these metrics since the 50s, I would say. So Branch Rickey, he was a very famous general manager for Brooklyn Dodgers. He was responsible for bringing in Jackie Robinson, who broke the color barrier in baseball. But he was also a very, very advanced and progressive looking general manager himself. Click next, please. So in 1950s, he wrote an article for Life magazine, and he talked a little bit about on-base percentage. It was a different version of on-base percentage than we know today, but he started asking questions that, maybe walks are a bit of a skill, and that's something we should incorporate in statistics rather than just use them as instead of just using batting average. So he was the first one who started questioning these. And technically, you can say the first statistician that was ever hired by a baseball team was this Canadian guy. His name was Alan Roth, and Branch Rickey had hired him. And what he did was he tried to drill down further into statistics, a lot more than teams had done in the past. So he would probably start tracking splits. He would look at platoon splits, and he would look at all these things just to give his team a little bit of competitive advantage. And Brooklyn Dodgers were a very successful team during that time. And then they started coming up with slugging. So when they said, with batting average, all hits are treated as equal, well, we've got to solve for that. So what they did was they assigned one base value to each hit. So if it's a single, it's one base. If it's a double, it's two base. It's a triple, three, and then home run is four. And then they came out with OPS, on base plus slugging. Next slide. Yep, that's one. So OPS is basically just a sum of OBP and slugging. Now, obviously, these two metrics also have their own challenges. So for example, is a home run really 4 times more valuable than a single? That's debatable. Obviously, not really, because a lot of times if you just hit a single home run or if you hit a single, so there are a lot of different factors that come into play. But overall, this was advancement in traditional statistics. And OPS, despite having a lot of noise in it, it still correlates very well with runs scored if you track a team's number of runs they score over a season. So this was obviously a much improvement. And then we started with the sabermetrics movement. So this started off with Bill James, late 70s. He started asking the question that we're probably valuing players incorrectly. And he started writing baseball abstracts in the 80s. So people who were born in 70s and probably 80s, they found this small online community to gather around and start looking at things a little bit more differently and started coming up with different statistics. So obviously, since then, advanced metrics has really changed the way we value players, how we formulate strategies. So a lot of these people actually started off using these stats to, have a competitive advantage in the fantasy leagues, and then suddenly they started investing more time in it, and you realize that it has a lot of value for other teams as well. So now we know that metrics that not only provide accurate information about how good a player truly is, but we can also make better educated guesses how we will perform in the future. So there are two when we look at it, advanced metrics. First, we want to take out the impact of defense. So for example, if you're looking at a pitcher, and I said with ERA, a lot depends on if the team's defense is strong or not. So what do we do to take defense out of equation? Just look at a player's skill. And then over time, we've also tried to take out luck as well. So how much of that was based on luck and how much was based on pitcher's skill. So what it does is it gives you some predictive value as to what you would expect. So if you're signing a player to a 5 or a 7-year contract for $150, $200 million, you better be sure that that player will perform up to that level. So some of these metrics that we've created, So weighted on-base average. So this is an improvement on on-base percentage. It doesn't treat all events as equal, so it assigns a value based on the number of runs that have been scored in the last few years. So I think a walk is about 72% of a single, and then single is a certain percentage of a double, triple, home run, so on and so forth. They've created the weighted runs created plus metric. So this basically is a metric on a scale of 100. So if your WRC plus is 100, that means you're a league average player. So for example, someone like a Mike Trout would have a year with a 195 WRC plus. That means he's 95% better for that particular year. And what it allows us to do is it allows us to value players or rate them across different eras as well. So if you look at Babe Ruth, it's hard to measure his statistics, take his raw numbers and Mike Trout's raw numbers or Barry Bonds' raw numbers and compare them across eras. Reason being that scoring was different in all these three eras. So obviously during Barry Bonds, you had a lot of steroid users. So obviously a lot of people were hitting home runs. During Babe Ruth's time, he broke the 13 home run record. He hit 29 home runs, and then he hit 50, and so on and so forth. So how much better was he than an average player at that time? And that kind of helps you put them on an even kneel. So it's helped over a historical perspective as well. And then the fielding independent pitching stat. So this is where you take out the defense for a pitcher, like you said, and you take out luck factor. So you see how many home runs they give up, how many walks they give up, how many strikeouts they have. So it kind of gives you a sense of what a pitcher can control and use that as a value. And then wins above replacement is a fairly new metric around the last 10 years as well. Short, they call it WAR. So basically what it measures is it takes all your skill level. So whether it's your defense, whether it's your offense, your base running ability, and they come up with a catch-all one stat that will tell you that if you're on the roster, on average, how many wins can you contribute to a team relative to a replacement player? So a replacement player would be someone who's available on the waivers at league minimum. So let's say if you sign Josh Donaldson, he's a 5 to a 6 win player. So he's a significant improvement. So you try to pay them accordingly as well. And when it comes to free agent contracts, it's helpful because, again, roster construction is a bit of an exercise in economics. So the more wins you get from one roster spot, the better it is. So it becomes a bit of a law of increasing returns. So a 5-win player versus a 7-win player, he's just not 2 wins better. He's probably exponentially better because you're getting that extra win out of him from that one same spot as well. So, and now since 2015, things have taken a dramatic turn. So StatCast. So StatCast is actually MLB's own initiative. They have an advanced media division and they came out with it. Can you click next one? Thanks. So it has basically changed everything and it's sort of leveled the playing field when it comes to in-game strategies for all teams. So all teams now have the ability to run predictive analytics. And how they do it is that every single major league ballpark, so all 30 of them, they have the Doppler radar technology, and they also have the pitch FX technology that sort of tracks every single movement in a major league game. So every single motion is captured. So whether it's a pitcher throwing a pitch, a hitter hitting the ball, or a defender or a fielder just making a play and throwing out a hit batter at first base, second base, or throwing it to the catcher. It's basically changed how teams are starting to value free agency. And it's probably made a biggest impact. And I think if any of you follow baseball news, you would know that this was a very slow offseason. Teams weren't willing to spend a lot on average to above average players. The only ones who got big contracts were the superstar caliber players, but the rest really struggled. And what it does is it captures motions, I think 2,500 times on a per second basis. And it has truly allowed teams to go from just traditional statistics to create their own proprietary databases. Analytics groups, because of this, have moved from like a group of 3 to 4 people per team to now you have a whole division of decision sciences, and you have 20, 25 people working for each team. And they try to build everything in-house, because if you go get something off the shelf, then chances are you might leak your own whatever your corporate secrets are. So it's very interesting that baseball is following the same path. Actually, one person working for the Houston Astros organization was charged with corporate espionage because he moved from St. Louis Cardinals to Astros, and he had access to their old passwords, and he accessed it, and I think he got some jail time for it as well, for corporate espionage. Very interesting. Next line, please. So like I said, so StatCast basically tracks the trajectory of the ball. So let's say it's about 2,000 samples per second, every single movement. We judge 3D distances. It's very interesting. So sometimes you'll see a player making a spectacular diving catch. We all, everyone applauds, but the system will tell you if the player, when he actually made that catch, did he have a good run, or was his route efficiency as good as it should have been? And what was the catch probability? So sometimes you'll see that someone's made a spectacular catch, but the catch probability was 80%. That means 80% of the people would have gotten to the ball. You probably should have taken a better first step and things like that. And for a pitcher, it would report on velocity. It would report on the movement. So whether the ball is moving vertically, horizontally, what's the spin rate, what's the velocity that it generates off the bat, barrel balls, and what was the hit probability. So again, getting into predictive analysis as well. Next line, please. And from a defensive standpoint, it measures hang time, like I said, catch probabilities, players' route efficiency, first step. Do you mind playing the video? So this was in 2015. Kevin Pillar, he just got traded yesterday, but.
Some things get better with time.
But that tuna wrap is past its prime.
Don't waste your hunger anytime, any place.
To know Henry with the mouth on your face. Oh, hungry.
Oh, Henry. Little flare, left center. Pilar makes the catch. He does it again, denying the Indians in their bid to take the lead here in the 10th inning. Canada does love Pilar, racing to left center to make the catch that preserves the tie. Well, Blue Jays fans have seen this countless times, it seems.
So that means
in the last couple of years, often racing back to the fence, this time having to come in and make the catch.
Dives and everything, and so it's interesting.
Some things get better with time.
But that tuna wrap is past its prime.
How are we doing on time? Oops.
Some things get better with time.
But that tuna wrap is past its prime.
Don't waste your hunger anytime, any place.
To know Henry with the mouth on your face. Oh, hungry.
Oh, Henry.
Okay.
Several years of research and development were realized in 2014 with the debut of MLB.com's StatCast, the first ever reliable measurement of every play on a baseball field. Pioneered by MLB Advanced Media and debuted with prototypes at the 2014 All-Star Game, League Championship Series, and World Series, StatCast's roots can be traced back roughly a decade earlier to MLB's introduction of pitch tracking. Pitch tracking delivered a never-before-seen wealth of detailed information regarding every pitch thrown in the major leagues. Though a bold move at the time, today, pitch tracking technology is ubiquitous throughout broadcast television and baseball's digital products. But despite the data compiled on pitching, never before have there been reliable defensive statistics. The goal with StatCast was to leverage the technology to ensure that defense could be quantified and that a more complete picture of our game be made available to fans. To that end, all 30 ballparks have been outfitted with two distinctly different but collaborative technologies to allow for the data capture, optical tracking, and radar tracking. High-definition video camera arrays spaced 15 meters apart to capture stereoscopic video, and a 3D Doppler radar system which captures 2,000 samples per second of the entire baseball field. By marrying the data from each of these systems, it is now possible to scientifically quantify the skills and talents of players on the field using new player performance metrics.
So you see, it's sort of taken a lot of subjectivity out of.
Some things get better with time.
But that tuna wrap is past its prime.
Don't waste your hunger anytime, any place.
To know.
So basically, so Houston Astros actually a couple of years ago they made the news. They're one of the most progressive organizations in baseball that they let go of all professional scouts scouting the Major League Baseball team. They still have scouts for minor leagues and college baseball and everything, but for professional baseball, they decided they don't need scouts anymore because, you know, when you're valuing and grading players, you're looking if he's got a good arm. We have all that information now, and we can quantify it, and we can basically create a baseline against the league average, and we know who's better, who's not. So we really don't need eye tests anymore. This is just an example. So Jacob deGrom is a Mets, New York Mets pitcher. So just kind of give you an example what other information people look at. So this is whiff percentage. So the number of times he generates swings and misses off his pitches. So you'll see we're talking about the four-seam fastball. So not only it would talk about all the pitches and what the percentage was over a period of time, it will also show you what the average break was. So if you see it, that's his average 17.31%. And it also gives you confidence intervals plus minus at 95, well, 95 confidence interval. And then it will also show you the sample size for 2018. So it kind of gives you an idea as to the level of depth that major league teams are looking at. Now, this is something that's available for everyone. So when I would write an article, I would reference something like this. Now, what teams have now is so proprietary, like a lot of times you won't even have any idea as to what they're working on, what they're developing. A lot of times, some of the analytics groups are not even housed in the same cities. They would probably house them elsewhere. They wouldn't hire them as employees of that particular organization. It'll probably be a different arm or something. It's very secretive in a lot of cases as well. A lot of times, some teams have started having an analytics person dress in a uniform and travel with the team to provide all the information. Pittsburgh Pirates are known for doing that. They'll basically provide the lineup to the manager. The manager is probably the most, I don't want to say meaningless, but the least impactful manager in all major sports in North America right now in baseball. Next line, please. So similarly, so going from the previous one was tracking whiff percentage. Now we're looking at vertical movement. So now it would show you that the sample size, again, he threw 1369 fastballs. His average movement was 9.47 inches. Confidence interval was 942 and 952. And it'll kind of give you an idea as to how much they've broken up. So 2014, it was 928. It has improved over a period of time. So, this is a pitcher that's currently not in decline. His fastball has stayed fairly consistent. And it'll also show you breaks on all the other pitches as well. Next slide. This is just, again, something similar. It was an article I wrote on Marco Estrada a couple of years ago. So this basically looks at his strike zone from 2015 to 16, and the other one is from 2017 to 18. So basically looking at where he generates all these whiff percentages against swings and misses. Estrada had some incredible success with Blue Jays early on in 2015 and 16, and a lot had to do with a very intelligent use of the strike zone because he has a below average fastball. He tops out at 89 miles per hour, and major league average is probably 92, 93 miles right now. So he was still very effective with that one fastball and a changeup. And the reason for that is he had started, and now you'll see a lot more teams and a lot more pitchers doing it, but he was one of the first few ones who figured out that he could probably generate a lot of plays and misses in the upper part of the strike zone. So not exactly in the strike zone, so not belt high where you can be hit for a home run, something above belt, but below the letters so that the players don't lay off those pitches. So it's very interesting, and he had a lot of success, increased his strikeout numbers as well, and then had a couple of pretty good runs with the Blue Jays in playoffs. Next. So what's next? So obviously with StatCast, because it's a major league MLB initiative, they share data with all 30 teams. So it sort of has nullified the in-game strategies. So a lot of teams are looking beyond just StatCast. They're looking at analytics and other areas as well. So like I said, roster construction is one thing where they want to see how do they maximize the value of a roster versus the cost that they pay for each player. So that's where a lot of teams are spending some time. Development for minor league players, obviously, now they've moved on to from major league clubs. Now a lot of teams are putting the same technology in their minor league divisions, trying to get a better sense and a better understanding of what it takes to become a successful major league player, because the attrition rate is very high. Not everyone makes it to the majors, obviously just 30 teams. Free agent signings, like I said, we've seen that impact this year. There's another thing that they're looking at, and that's 3D modeling. And the reason being StatCast does 2D modeling, but players obviously are three-dimensional. So the next conversation has been around, can you put sensors in players so you can, you have a better sense as to if they're about to get injured, track their fatigue levels and see if, the bodies are making optimal, like if they're making an optimal throws. Biomechanics is one thing that they're working on. Bat speed. So for example, we track bat speed right now, but they're talking about putting sensors in bats now, sensors in ball. So right now, spin, obviously, they calculate spin rate in 2D. Can they do it in the 3D plane? So it's all very interesting. We don't know where it's going to grow. They get massive amount of data now. So again, the opportunities are endless. And then maximize your resource as best as you can. And you try to look for competitive advantage every year. Now, Blue Jays recently made headlines a few weeks ago. They announced that they're going to increase every minor league player's salary by 50%. The reason being that minor league players are paid extremely terribly. You're talking about $5,000 to $10,000 a year. So before you make it into the majors, you have to struggle through a lot to make it, to become successful. And obviously, one area Blue Jays found is that instead of spending all the money on the roster, when the time comes, hopefully they do spend. But in the meantime, can you attract and retain some talent at the minor league level, just increasing the salary by 50%? Because when you don't make money, obviously nutrition-wise, you make bad decisions, right? I mean, obviously you're trying to save money. If you read this book by Dirk Hayhurst, he's a former baseball player, played for Blue Jays as well. And he said that his daily lunch was peanut butter and jelly sandwiches, right? Like he wouldn't afford anything else. He had a styrofoam cooler. He would keep all his stuff in because obviously trying to save as much money as he can. So teams are trying to maximize resources, look at all these things. Injury rehabilitation is another part. A lot of players spend a lot of time the injured list. And I think there's an estimate that almost $50 to $70 million a year worth of players go on injured list. So obviously, how can you prevent injuries? And when you talk about putting sensors in players, you're trying to figure out, get ahead of the curve and see if there's an injury coming and can you prevent it rather than just rehab them. So that's basically it. Like I said, you talk about injury prevention, biomechanics, we talked about it. Next slide, please. So that's basically it. If you guys have any questions, you can follow me on Twitter. I tweet at DRC over WRC, which is deserve runs created over weighted runs created. It's just a baseball thing. And I write for beyondtheboxscore.com. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask. And thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate this. No, I don't think so. I think it's team's proprietary information, so players don't have access to it. Yeah, possibly. Sports in general is like a Hollywood thing, but I think most of the excitement in sports comes from the outliers. Yes. So are you at all worried that, like, with this big movement, excitement? It's a good question, but I don't know. We'll probably find out when we get there, right? I mean, at the end of the day, when you're actually playing the game, you really don't think about it. Like if I'm watching soccer Sunday morning, I really don't think well, I mean, sometimes you follow what the probabilities are, but at a general level, you don't care when you're watching the sport live in action. But from a team perspective, it does make sense to take out all, because there's so much money in the game now. We're talking about millions of dollars. It makes sense to take out all those factors that, you take care of, like you isolate luck and you isolate all the other external variable factors. So I think from a team standpoint, it makes sense. But for an average fan, I don't know, even if you're very analytic savvy, when you go to the game, I don't know how much you would think about it. You probably would just enjoy the game. But honestly, probably know more once we get there. You had a question in the front? I did, yeah. Sorry.
I was wondering, how did you get into sports analytics, or slash, how does one get into sports analytics?
Well, good question. So if you were going to ask this question like 15, 20 years ago, it probably just needed, ability to extract some data from websites and stuff, and you're good to go. A lot of teams now are hiring players, like individuals with masters or PhDs in either physics or computer science. Obviously, with StatCast, you need to clean up a lot of anomalies and things like that. So the best place to start is if you have an advanced degree in computer science or physics or something like that. You had a question as well? Sorry. Yes.
I was just going to follow up from him. I took sports listening first, so I was really into it. What I always saw with the Blue Jays is that they kind of ranked behind or progressive towards this. Has Blue Jays changed at all, or are they still kind of lacking?
No, they've taken a lot of steps towards that. So under the previous regime, Alex Anthopoulos, they first created their own database. They call it the Beast, and obviously they started off collecting all the information, scouting reports, keeping everything in one place. I think this regime is probably taking it a lot further. Cleveland was one of the first, like one of the earliest adopters, along with Oakland Athletics. And Mark Shapiro was in the middle of all of this. And with him being here, they've spent a lot of time. They recently hired a writer from Fangraphs, which is a very famous website for baseball analytics, Carson Sicilian. And again, we don't know what exactly his role is, but he was very famous on writing articles about fringe 5 prospects, so not like all your main prospects, but somewhere like a few that were on the fringe that may make it to next step. So people think that that's where his value lies. And with all the data, the other opportunity these teams are looking at, and Blue Jays are investing heavily in it, is do you have people who can visualize that data for people who are not very data savvy? So for example, players, right? Can you write these stories? Can you create visuals for them where it's easy to understand? So no, I would say they're on the right track for sure.
Yeah, I've set other questions.
Yeah.
I know most of these stats are available. Maybe not. I'm not sure about baseball, but I know like basketball references that is super quick on stats. Can those things help us with our fantasy game at all in terms of roster construction?
Yeah, I would think so. It depends on what kind of metrics you set up for your fantasy, right? So for example, like when I play fantasy hockey, I usually don't pay too much attention to that. But when I'm playing baseball, if you have the traditional metrics of hits, runs, probably not so much. But if you have metrics like strikeout to walk ratio and things like that, yeah, absolutely, you can go on the websites. So baseball reference is obviously a big one, and Fangraphs is probably another one. Any other questions? I guess that's it. Thank you very much. Really appreciate your time. Thank you.